everything working. Everything's fucking family-friendly show. Shouldn't be saying that. Alright. Hello everyone, welcome again. I'm going to be reading today by popular demand via my personal Facebook some tales from Norse mythology. And it's not going to be the prose Edda today or the poetic Edda, just the retellings done by Padraic Colum right from the beginning and far away and long ago. Once there was another sun and another moon, and a different sun and a different moon from the ones we see now. Sol was the name that was the name of that sun, and Mani was the name of that moon. But always behind Sol and Mani, wolves went, a wolf behind each. The wolves caught on them at the last, and they devoured Sol and Mani, and the world was in darkness and cold. In those times the gods lived, Odin and Thor, Hodur and Baldur, Tyr and Heimdall, Vidar and Vali, as well as Loki, doer of good and the doer of evil. And the beautiful goddesses were living then, Freyja and Freya, Nanna, Iduna, and Sif. But in the days when the sun and the moon were destroyed, the gods were destroyed too. All the gods except Baldur, who had died before that time, Vidar and Vali, the sons of Odin, Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor. At that time, too, there were men and women in the world. Before the sun and the moon were devoured, and before the gods were destroyed, terrible things happened in the world. Snow fell on the four corners of the earth and kept falling for 3 seasons. Winds came and blew everything away, and the people of the world who lived on in spite of the snow and the cold and the winds fought each other, brother killing brother, until all the people were destroyed. Also, there was another earth at that time, an earth green and beautiful, but the terrible winds that blew leveled down the forests and hills and dwellings. Then fire came and burnt the earth, and there was darkness, for the sun and the moon were devoured. The gods had met their doom, and at the time in which these things happened was called Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Then a new sun and a new moon appeared and went traveling through the heavens. They were more lovely than Sol and Mani, and no wolves followed behind them in chase. The earth became green and beautiful again, and in a deep forest, and that the fire had not burnt, and with a deep forest that the fire had not burnt a woman and a man wakened up. They had been hidden there by Odin and left to sleep during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Lif was the woman's name, and Liftreisir was the man's. They moved through the world, and their children and their children's children's children made people for the new earth. And of the gods were left Vidar and Vali, the sons of Odin, and Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor. On the new earth, Vidar and Vali found tablets that the older gods had written on and left there for them. Tablets telling them of all that had happened before Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And the people who lived after Ragnarok were not troubled, as the people in the older days had been troubled, by the terrible beings who had brought destruction upon the world and upon men and women, from whom the beginning had waged war upon the gods. The building of the wall. Always there had been a war between the giants and the gods, between the giants who would have destroyed the world and the race of men, and the gods who would have protected the race of men and would have made the world more beautiful. There were many stories to be told about the gods, but the first one that shall be told to you is the one about the building of their city. The gods had made their way up to the top of a high mountain, and there they had decided to build a great city for themselves that the giants could never overthrow. The city they would call Asgard, which means the palace of the gods. They would build it on a beautiful plain, and that was on the top of that high mountain. And they wanted to raise round their city the highest and strongest walls that had ever been built. Now one day, when they were beginning to build their halls and their palaces, a strange being came to them. Odin, the father of the gods, went and spoke to him. "What dost thou want on the mountain of the gods?" he asked the stranger. I know what is in the mind of the gods," the stranger said. "They would build a city here. I cannot build palaces, but I can build great walls that can never be overthrown. Let me build the wall around your city." "How long will it take you to build a wall that will go around our city?" said the father of the gods. "A year, O Odin," said the stranger. Now Odin knew that if a great wall could be built around it, the gods would not have to spend all of their time defending the city from the giants, and he knew that if Asgard were protected, he himself could go amongst men and teach and help them. He thought that no payment the stranger could ask would be too much for building the wall. That day the stranger came to the council of the gods, and he swore that in a year he could have the great wall built. Then Odin made the oath that the gods would give him whatever he asked in return if the wall was finished to the last stone in a year from that day. The stranger went away and came back on the morrow. It was the first day of summer when he started work. He brought no one there to help him except a great horse. Now the gods thought that this horse would do no more than drag blocks of stone for the building of the wall. But the horse did more than this. He set the stones in their places and mortared them together. And day and night, and by light and dark, the horse worked, and soon a great wall was rising around the palaces that the gods themselves were building. "What reward will the stranger ask for the work he is doing for us?" the gods asked another. Odin went to the stranger. "We marvel at the work you and your horse are doing for us," he said. "No one can doubt that the great wall of Asgard will be built up by the first day of summer. What reward do you claim? We would have it ready for you." The stranger turned from the work he was doing, leaving the great horse to pile up bricks again. "O father of the gods," he said, "O Odin, the reward I shall ask for my work is the sun and the moon and Freya, who watches over the flowers and grasses, for my wife." Now when Odin heard this, he was terribly angered, for the price the stranger asked for his work was beyond all prices. He went amongst the other gods who were then building and shining their palaces within the great wall, and he told them what reward the stranger had asked. The gods said, "Without the sun and the moon, the world will wither away." And the goddesses said, "Without Freya, we will all be gloom in Asgard." They would have let the wall remain unbuilt rather than let the stranger have the reward he claimed for building it. But one who was in the company of the gods spoke. He was Loki, a being who only half belonged to the gods. His father was the wind giant. "Let the stranger build the wall around Asgard," Loki said, "and I will find a way to make him give up the hard bargain he has made for the gods. Go to him and tell him the wall must be finished by the first day of summer, and that if it is not finished on the last stone on that day, the price he asks will not be given to him." The gods went to the stranger, and they told him that if the last stone was not laid on the wall on the first day of summer, not Sol nor Mani, the sun and the moon, nor Freya could be given to him. And now they knew that the stranger was one of the giants. The giant and his great horse piled up the wall more quickly than the night before. At night, while the giant slept, the horse worked on it, hauling stones up and down and laying them on the wall with his great forefeet. And day by day, the wall around Asgard grew higher and higher. But the gods had no joy in seeing that the great wall was rising higher and higher around their palaces. The giant and his horse would finish the work by the first day of summer, and then he would take the sun and the moon, Sol and Mani, and Freya away with him. But Loki was not disturbed. He kept telling the gods that he would find a way to prevent him from finishing his work. Thus he would make the great giant forfeit the terrible price he had led Odin to promise him. It was 3 days till summertime. All the wall was finished except the gateway. Over the gateway a stone was still to be placed, and the giant, before he went to sleep, bade his horse to haul up a great block of stone so that they might put it above the gateway in the morning, and so finished the work 2 days before summer. It happened to be a beautiful moonlight night. Svadilfari, the giant's great horse, was hauling the largest stone ever hauled when he saw the little mare coming galloping towards him. The great horse had never been so pretty, and a little mare he looked at had never seen so pretty a little mare, and he looked at her with surprise. "Svadilfari, slave," said the little mare to him, and went frisking past. Svadilfari put the stone down that he was hauling and called to the little mare. He came back to him. "Why do you call me Svadilfari slave?" said the great horse. "Because you have to work night and day for your master," said the little mare. "He keeps you working and working and working and never lets you enjoy yourself. You dare not leave that stone down and come play with me." "Who told you I dare not do it?" said Svadilfari. "I know you daren't do it," said the little mare, and she kicked up her heels and ran across the moonlit meadow. Now the truth is that Svadilfari was tired of working night and day. When he saw the little mare go galloping off, he became suddenly discontented. He left the stone he was hauling on the ground. He looked round and round and saw the little mare looking back at him, and he galloped after her. He did not catch up with the little mare. He went on swiftly before him. On she went over the moonlit meadow, turning and looking back now and again to see great Svadilfari, who came heavily after her. Down the mountainside the mare went, and Svadilfari, who now rejoiced in his liberty, in the freshness of the wind and the smell of the flowers, still followed her. With the morning's light they came near a cave, and the little mare went in. Then they went through the cave. Then Svadilfari caught up to the little mare, and the two went wandering together, the little mare telling him stories of the dwarves and the elves. They came to a grove and stayed together in it, the little mare playing so nicely with him that the great horse forgot all about time passing. And while they were in the grove, the giant was going up and down, searching for his great horse. He had come to the wall in the morning, expecting to put the stone over the gateway and so to finish his work. But the stone that was to be lifted up was not near him. He called for Svadilfari, but the great horse did not come. He went to search for him, and searched up and down the mountainsides, and he searched as far as the earth and the realms of the giants, but he did not find him. The gods saw the first day of summer come, and the gateway of the wall stand unfinished. They said to each other that if it were not finished by the evening, they need not give Mani to the giant, nor the maiden Freya to be his wife. The hours of the summer day went past, and the giant did not raise the stone over the gateway. In the evening he came before them. "Your work is not finished," Odin said. "You forced us a hard bargain, and now we need not keep it with you. You shall not be given Mani, nor the maiden Freya." "Only the wall I have built is so strong I could tear it down," said the giant. He tried to throw down one of the palaces, but the gods laid hands on him and thrust him outside the wall he had built. "Go and trouble Asgard no more," Odin commanded. Then Loki returned to Asgard. He told the gods how he had transformed himself into a little mare and led Svadilfari, the giant's great horse. And the gods sat in their golden palaces behind the great wall and rejoiced that their city was now secure, and no enemy could ever enter it or overthrow it. But Odin, father of the gods, as he sat up upon his throne, was sad in his heart, sad that the gods had gotten their wall built up by a trick, and oaths had been broken, and that a blow had been struck in injustice in Asgard. Iduna and her apples. How Loki put the gods in danger. In Asgard there was a garden, and in that garden grew a tree, and on that tree there grew shining apples. Thou knowst, O well-loved one, that every day that passes makes us older and brings to us that day when we will be bent and feeble, gray-headed and weak-eyed. But those shining apples that grew in Asgard, they who ate of them every day grew never a day older, for eating of the apples kept the old age away. Iduna, the goddess, tended the tree on which the shining apples grew. None would grow on the tree unless she was there to tend it. No one but Iduna might pick the shining apples. Each morning she plucked them and left them in her basket, and every day the gods and goddesses came to her garden that they might eat the shining apples and so stay young forever. Iduna never went from her garden. All day and every day she stayed in the garden, or in her golden house beside it, and all day and every day she listened to Bragi, her husband, tell a story that never had an end. Ah, but a time came when Iduna and her apples were lost to Asgard, and the gods and goddesses felt old age approach them. How all that happened shall be told to thee, O well-beloved. Odin, the father of the gods, often went to the land of men to watch over their doings. Once he took Loki with him, and Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. For a long time they went traveling through the world of men, and at last they came to Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. It was a bleak and empty region. There were no growing things there, not even with trees and berries. There were no birds, and there were no animals. As Odin, the father of the gods, and Loki, the doer of good and doer of evil, went through this region, hunger came upon them. But in all the land around they saw nothing that they could eat. Loki, running here and there, came last upon a herd of wild cattle. Creeping up on them, he caught hold of a young bull and killed him. Then he cut up the flesh into strips of meat. He lighted a fire and put the meat on the spits to roast. While the meat was being cooked, Odin, the father of the gods, a little way off, sat thinking on the things that he had seen in the world of men. Loki made himself busy putting more and more logs on the fire. At last he called to Odin, and the father of the gods came and sat down near the fire to eat the meal. But when the meat was taken off the cooking spits, and Odin went to cut it, he found that it was still raw. He smiled at Loki for thinking the meat was cooked, and Loki, troubled that he had made a mistake, put the meat back, and put more logs upon the fire. Again Loki took the meat off the cooking spits and called Odin to the meal. Odin, when he took the meat that Loki had brought him, found that it was raw as if he had never put it upon the fire. "Is this a trick of yours, Loki?" he said. Loki was so angry at the meat not being undercooked that Odin saw he was playing no tricks. In his hunger, he raged at the meat, and he raged at the fire. Again, he put the meat on the cooking spits and put more logs on the fire. Every hour, he would take up the meat, sure that it was now cooked, and every time he took it off, Odin would find that the meat was as raw as the first time they took it off the fire. Now Odin knew that this meat must be under some enchantment by the giants. He stood up and went on his way, hungry but strong. Loki, however, could not leave the meat that he had put back on the fire. He would make it cooked, he declared, and he would not leave the place hungry. The dawn came and he took up the meat again. As he was lifting it off the fire, he heard a whir of wings above his head. Looking up, he saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that had ever appeared in the sky. The eagle circled round and came above Loki's head. "Canst thou not cook thy food?" the eagle screamed at him. "I cannot cook it," said Loki. "Well, I will cook it for thee if thou wilt give me a share," screamed the eagle. "Come then and cook it for me," Loki said. The eagle circled round until he was above the fire, and then flapping his great wings over it, he made the fire blaze and blaze. A heat that Loki had never felt before came from the burning logs. In a minute he drew the meat from the spits and found it was well cooked. My share, give me my share," the eagle screamed at him. He flew down, and seizing on a large piece of meat, he instantly devoured it. He seized on another piece. Piece after piece he devoured until it looked as if Loki would be left with no meat for his meal. As the eagle seized on the last piece, Loki became angry indeed. Taking up the spit on which the meat had been cooked, he struck at the eagle. There was a clang as if he had struck some metal. The wood of the spit did not come away. It stuck to the breast of the eagle. But Loki did not let go hold on the spit. Suddenly the eagle rose in the air. Loki, who held the spit that was fastened to the eagle's breast, was drawn up with him. Before he knew what had happened, Loki was miles and miles up in the air, and the eagle was flying with him around Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, and the eagle was screaming out, "Loki, friend Loki, I have thee at last. It was thou who didst cheat my brother of his reward for building the wall around Asgard. But Loki, I have thee at last. Know now that Thjassi the giant has captured thee, O Loki, most cunning of the dwellers of Asgard." Thus the eagle screamed as he went flying with Loki towards Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. They passed over the river that divides Jotunheim from Midgard, the world of men. And now Loki saw a terrible place beneath it, a land of ice and rock. Great mountains were there. They lighted up by neither sun nor moon, but by columns of fire thrown up every now and again through the cracks in the earth, or out of the peaks of the mountains. Over a great iceberg the eagle hovered. Suddenly he shook the spit from his breast, and Loki fell down on the ice. The eagle screamed out at him, "Thou art in my power at last, O most cunning of the dwellers of Asgard!" The eagle left Loki there and flew within a crack in the mountains. Miserable indeed was Loki upon that iceberg. The cold was deadly. He could not die there, for he was one of the dwellers in Asgard, and death might not come to him in that way. He might not die, but he felt bound to the iceberg with chains of cold. After a day his captor came to him, not as an eagle this time, but in his own form, Thiassi the giant. "Wouldst thou leave thine iceberg, Loki," he said, "and return to thy pleasant place in Asgard? Dost thou delight in Asgard, although only by one half dost thou belong to the gods? Thy father, Loki, was a wind giant." "Oh, that I might leave this iceberg," Loki said, with tears freezing on his face. "Thou mayst leave it, when thou showest thyself ready to pay the ransom to me," said Thiassi. Thou wilt have to get me the shining apples that Iduna keeps in her basket." "But I cannot get Iduna's apples for thee, Thiassi," said Loki. "Then stay upon the iceberg," said Thiassi the giant. He went away and left Loki there, with terrible winds buffeting at him in the blows as with blows of a hammer. When Thiassi came again and spoke to him about his ransom, Loki said, "Is there no way of getting the shining apples from Iduna?" "There must be some way, O cunning Loki," said the giant. "Iduna, although she guards the shining apples, is simple-minded," said Loki. "It may be that I shall be able to get her outside the great wall of Asgard. If she goes, she will bring her shining apples with her, for she never lets them go out of her hands except for when she gives them to the gods and goddesses to eat. Make it so that she will go beyond the wall of Asgard," said the giant. "If she goes outside the wall, I shall get the apples from her. Swear by the world tree that thou wilt lure Iduna beyond the walls of Asgard. Swear it, Loki, and I shall let thee go." "I swear by Yggdrasil, the world tree, that I will lure Iduna beyond the wall of Asgard, if thou wilt take me off this iceberg," said Loki. Then Thiassi changed himself into the mighty eagle, taking Loki in his talons, and flew him over the stream that divides Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, from Midgard, the world of men. He left Loki on the ground of Midgard, and Loki then went on his way to Asgard. Now Odin had already returned, and he had told the dwellers in Asgard of Loki's attempt to cook the enchanted meat. All laughed to think that Loki had been left hungry for all of his cunning. Then when he came into Asgard looking so famished, they thought it was because Loki had nothing to eat. They laughed at him more and more. But they brought him into the feast hall, and gave him the best of food with wine out of Odin's cup. When the feast was over, the dwellers in Asgard went to Iduna's garden, as was their wont. There sat Iduna in the golden house that opened into her garden. Had she been in the world of men, everyone who saw her would have remembered their own innocence, seeing one who was so fair and good. She had eyes as blue as the blue sky, and she smiled as if she were remembering lovely things she had seen or heard. The basket of shining apples was beside her. To each god and goddess Iduna gave a shining apple. Each one ate the apple given, rejoicing to think that they would never become a day older. Then Odin, the father of the gods, said the runes that were always said in praise of Iduna, and the dwellers in Asgard went out of Iduna's garden, each one going to his or her own shining house. All went except Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. Loki sat in the garden, watching fair and simple Iduna. After a while she spoke to him and said, "Why dost thou still stay here, wise Loki?" To look well upon thine apples, Loki said. I'm wondering if the apples I saw yesterday are really the shining apples as they are in that basket. There are no apples in the world as shining as mine, said Iduna. The apples I saw were more shining. Aye, and they smelled better, Iduna. Iduna was troubled at what Loki, whom she deemed so wise, had told her. Her eyes filled with tears that there might be more shining apples in the world than hers. Oh, Loki, she said, it cannot be. No apples are more shining, and none smell so sweet as the apples that I pluck off the tree in my garden. Go then and see, said Loki. Just outside Asgard is a tree that has the apples I saw. Thou, Iduna, dost never leave thy garden, and so thou dost not know what grows in the world. Go outside of Asgard and see. I will go, Loki, said Iduna, the fair and simple. Iduna went outside the wall of Asgard. She went to the place Loki had told her that the apples grew in. But as she looked this way and that way, Iduna heard a whir of wings above her. Looking up, she saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that had ever appeared in the sky. She drew back towards the gate of Asgard, and then the great eagle swooped down. Iduna felt herself lifted up, and then she was being carried away from Asgard, away, away, away over Midgard where the men lived, away towards the rocks and snows of Jotunheim. Across the river that flows between the world of men and the realm of the giants, Iduna was born. Then the eagle flew into a cleft in the mountain, and Iduna was left in a cavernous hall lighted up by columns of fire that burst from the earth. The eagle loosened his grip on Iduna, and she sank down on the grounds in the cavern. The wings and the giant feathers fell from him, and she saw her captor as the terrible giant. Oh, why have you carried me off from Asgard and brought me to this place? Iduna cried. That I might eat your shining apples, Iduna, said Thiassi the giant. That will never be, for I will not give them to you, Iduna said. Give me the apples to eat, and I shall carry you back to Asgard. No, no, that cannot be. I have been trusted with the shining apples that I might give them to the gods only. Then I shall take the apples from you, said Thiassi the giant. He took the basket out of her hands and opened it. But when he touched the apples, they shriveled under his hands. He left them in the basket, and he set the basket down, for he knew now that the apples would not be good to him unless Iduna gave them to him with her own hands. You must stay with me here until you give me the shining apples, he said to her. Then was poor Iduna frightened. She was frightened of the strange cave, and frightened of the fire that kept bursting out of the earth, and she was frightened of the terrible giant. But above all, she was frightened to think of the evil that would fall upon the dwellers in Asgard if she were not there to give them the shining apples to eat. The giant came to her again, but still Iduna would not give him the shining apples. And there in the cave she stayed, the giant troubling her every day, and she grew more and more fearful as she saw in her dreams that the dwellers in Asgard go to her garden, go there and not being given the shining apples, feeling and seeing a change come over themselves and over each other. It was as Iduna saw in her dreams. Every day the dwellers in Asgard went to her garden, Odin and Thor and Hoder and Balder, Tyr and Heimdall, Vidar and Vali, with Frigga and Freya, Nanna and Sif. There was no one to pluck the apples of their tree, and a change began to come over the gods and goddesses. They no longer walked lightly, their shoulders became bent. Their eyes no longer were as bright as dewdrops, and when they looked upon one another, they saw the change. Age was coming upon the dwellers in Asgard. They knew that the time would come when Frigga would grow grey and old, when Sif's golden hair would fade, when Odin would no longer have his clear wisdom, and when Thor would not have strength enough to raise and fling his thunderbolts. And the dwellers in Asgard were saddened by this knowledge, and it seemed to them that brightness had gone from the shining city. Where was Iduna, whose apples would give them back youth and strength and beauty to the dwellers of Asgard? The gods had searched for her through the world of men. No trace of her did they find. But now Odin, searching through his wisdom, saw a means to get knowledge of where Iduna was hidden. He summoned his two ravens, Hugin and Mudin, his two ravens that flew through the earth and through the realms of giants. and that knew all things that were past and all things that were to come. He summoned Hugin and Mudin, and they came. One sat on his right shoulder, and one sat on his left shoulder, and they told him deep secrets. They told him of Thiassi, and of his desire of the shining apples that the dwellers in Asgard ate, and of Loki's deception of Iduna, the fair and simple. What Odin learned from his ravens was told in the council of the gods. Then Thor the Strong went to Loki and laid his hands upon him. When Loki found himself in the grip of the strong god, he said, What wouldst thou with me, O Thor? I would hurl thee into the chasm in the ground and strike thee with my thunder, said the strong god. It was thou who didst bring this upon Iduna and went from Asgard. O Thor, said Loki, do not crush me with thy thunder. Let me stay in Asgard. I will strive to win Iduna back. The judgment of the gods, said Thor, is that thou, the cunning one, shouldst go to Jotunheim and by thy craft win Iduna back from the giants. Go, or else I shall hurl thee into a chasm and crush thee with my thunder. I will go, said Loki. From Freyja, the wife of Odin, Loki borrowed the dress of falcon feathers that she owned. He clad himself in it and flew to Jotunheim in the form of a falcon. Hi guys. He searched through Jotunheim until he found Thiassi's daughter Skadi. He flew before Skadi, and he let the giant maid catch him and hold him as a pet. One day the giant maid carried him to the cave where Iduna, the fair and simple, was being held. When Loki saw Iduna there, he knew that part of his quest had ended. Now he had to get Iduna out of Jotunheim and away to Asgard. He stayed no more with the giant maid, but flew up the high rocks of the cave. Skadi wept for the flight of her pet, but she ceased to search and call, and went away from the cave. Then Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil, flew where to Iduna was sitting and spoke to her. Iduna, when she knew that the dwellers of Asgard was near, wept with joy. Loki told her what she was to do. By the power of a spell that was given to him, he was able to change her into the form of a sparrow. But before she did this, she took the shining apples out of her basket and flung them into places where the giants would never find them. Skadi, coming back to the cave, saw the falcon fly out with the sparrow beside him. She cried out to her father, and the giant knew that the falcon was Loki and the sparrow was Iduna. He changed himself into the form of the mighty eagle. By this time the sparrow and falcon were out of sight, but Thiassi, knowing he could make better flight than they flew towards Asgard. Soon as he saw them, they flew with all the power they had, but the great wings of the eagle brought him nearer and nearer to them. The dwellers in Asgard, standing on the wall, saw the falcon and sparrow, with the great eagle pursuing them. They knew who they were, Loki and Iduna, with Thiassi in pursuit. As they watched the eagle winging nearer and nearer, the dwellers in Asgard were fearful that the falcon and the sparrow would be caught, and that Iduna would be taken away by Thiassi. They lighted great fires upon the wall, knowing that Loki would find a way through the fires, bringing Iduna with him, but Thiassi would not find a way. The falcon and the sparrow flew towards the fires. Loki went between the flames and brought Iduna with him, and Thiassi, coming up to the fires and finding no way through, beat his wings against the flames. He fell down from the wall, and the death that came to him afterwards was laid to Loki. Thus Iduna was brought back to Asgard. Once again she sat in the golden house that opened into her garden. Once again she plucked the shining apples off the tree she tended, and once again she gave them to the dwellers in Asgard. And as the dwellers in Asgard walked lightly away, and the brightness came into their eyes and into their cheeks again, age no more approached them. The youth came back, light and joy were again in Asgard. Sif's golden hair, how Loki wrought mischief in Asgard. All who dwell in Asgard, the Aesir and the Aesnir, who were the gods and the goddesses, and the Vanir, who were the friends of the gods and goddesses, were wroth with Loki. It was no wonder that they were wroth with him, for he had let the giant Thiassi carry off Iduna and her golden apples. Still, it must be told that the show they made of their wrath made Loki ready to do more mischief in Asgard. One day he saw a chance to do mischief that made his heart rejoice. Sif, the wife of Thor, was lying asleep outside her house. Her beautiful golden hair flowed all around her. Loki knew how much Thor had loved that shining hair, and how greatly Sif prized it because of Thor's love. Here was his chance to do a great mischief. Smilingly, he took out his shears and he cut off the shining hair, every strand and every tress. She did not waken while her treasure was being taken from her, but Loki left Sif's head cropped and bare. Thor was away from Asgard. Coming back to the city of the gods, he went to his house. Sif, his wife, was not there to welcome him. He called to Sif, but no glad answer came from her. To the palaces of the gods and goddesses Thor went, but in none of them did he find Sif, his golden-haired wife. When he was coming back to his house, he heard his name whispered. He stopped, and then a figure stole out from behind a stone. A veil covered her head, and Thor scarce knew that this was Sif, his wife. As he went to her, she sobbed and sobbed. "O Thor, my husband," she said, "do not look upon me. I am ashamed that you should see me. I shall go from Asgard, and from the company of the gods and goddesses, and I shall go down to Svartalfheim and live amongst the dwarves. I cannot bear that any of the dwellers of Asgard should look upon me now." "Oh, Sif," cried Thor, "what has happened to change you?" "I have lost the hair on my head," said Sif. "I have lost the beautiful golden hair that you, Thor, loved. You will not love me any more, and so I must go away, down to Svartalfheim, to the company of the dwarves. They are as ugly as I am now." Then she took the veil off her head, and Thor saw that all her beautiful hair was gone. She stood before him, shamed and sorrowful, and he grew into a mighty rage. "Who was it that did this to you, Sif?" he said. "I am Thor, the strongest of all the dwellers in Asgard, and I shall see to it that all the powers that the gods possess will be used to give your fairness back. Come to me, Sif." And taking his wife's hand in his, Thor went to the council house where the gods and goddesses were. Sif covered her head with her veil, for she would not have the gods and goddesses look upon her shorn head. But from the anger in Thor's eyes, all saw the wrong done to Sif was great indeed. And then Thor told of the cutting of her beautiful hair. A whisper went through the council house. "It was Loki did this. No one else in Asgard would have done a deed so shameful," one said to the other. "Loki it was who did this," said Thor. "He has hidden himself, but I shall find him and I will slay him." "Nay, not so, Thor," said Odin, the father of the gods. "Nay, no dweller in Asgard may slay another. I shall summon Loki to come before us here. It is for you to make him, and remember that Loki is cunning and able to do many things. Bring back to Sif the beauty of her golden hair." Then the call of Odin, the call that all in Asgard have to hearken to, went through the city of the gods. Loki heard it, and he had to come from his hiding place and enter the house where the gods had held their council. And when he looked on Thor and saw the rage that was in his eyes, and when he looked on Odin and saw the sternness in the face of the father of the gods, he knew that he would have to make amends for the shameful wrong he had done to Sif. Said Odin, "There is a thing that you, Loki, have done to there is a thing that you, Loki, have to do. Restore Sif the beauty of her hair." Loki looked at Odin. Loki looked at Thor, and he saw that what was said would have to be done. His quick mind searched to find a way of restoring to Sif the beauty of her golden hair. "I shall do as you command, Odin Allfather," he said. "But before we tell you of what Loki did to restore the beauty of Sif's golden hair, we must tell you of the other beings besides the gods and goddesses who were in the world at the time. First there was the Vanir. When the gods who were called the Aesir came to the mountains on which they built Asgard, they found other beings there. These were not wicked and ugly like the giants. They were beautiful and friendly. The Vanir they were named. Although they were beautiful and friendly, the Vanir had no thought of making this world more beautiful or more happy. In that way they differed from the Aesir who had such a thought. The Aesir made peace with them, and they lived together in friendship. But the Vanir came to do things that helped the Aesir make the world more beautiful and happy. Freya, whom the giant had wanted to take away with the sun and the moon, as a reward for building the wall around Asgard, was of the Vanir. The other beings of the Vanir were Frey, who was the brother of Freya, and Njord, who was their father. On the earth below there were other beings, the dainty elves who danced and fluttered about, attending to the trees and flowers and grasses. The Vanir were permitted to rule over the elves. Then below the earth, in caves and hollows, there was another race, the dwarves or the gnomes, little twisted creatures who were both wicked and ugly, but who were the best craftsmen in the world. In the days when neither the Aesir nor the Vanir were friendly to him, Loki used to go down to Svartalfheim, the dwarf's dwelling below the earth. And now that he was commanded to restore to Sif the beauty of her hair, Loki thought that he might get help from the dwarves. Down, down, down through the winding passages in the earth he went, and he came at last to where the dwarfs who were the most friendly to him were working in their forges. All the dwarfs were master smiths, and when he came upon his friends, he found them working hammer and tongs, beating metals into many shapes. He watched them for a while and took note of the things they were making. One was a spear so well balanced and made that it would hit whatever mark it was thrown at, no matter how bad the aim the thrower had. The other was a boat that could sail on any sea, but that could be folded up so that it could go into one's pocket. The spear was called Gugnir, and the boat was called Skidbladnir. Hopefully. Loki made himself very agreeable to the dwarves, praising their work and promising them things that only the dwellers in Asgard could give, things that the dwarfs longed to possess. He talked to them till the little ugly folk thought that they would come to own Asgard and all that was in it. At last Loki said to him, "Have you got a bar of fine gold that you can hammer into threads so fine that they would be like the hair of Sif, Thor's wife? Only the dwarfs could make a thing so wonderful." "Ah, there is a bar of gold. Hammer it into those fine threads, and the gods themselves will be jealous of your work." Flattered by Loki's speeches, the dwarves who were in the forge took up the bar of fine gold and flung it into the fire. Then taking it out and putting it upon their anvil, they worked on the bar with their tiny hammers until they beat it into threads that were as fine as the hair on one's head. But that was not enough. They had to be as fine as the hairs on Sif's head, and these were finer than anything else. They worked on the threads over and over again until they were as fine as the hairs on Sif's head. The threads were as bright as sunlight, and when Loki took up the mass of worked gold, it flowed from his raised hand down onto the ground. It was so fine that it could be put into his palm, and it was so light that a bird might not feel its weight. Then Loki praised the dwarfs more and more, and he made more and more promises to them. He charmed them all, and although they were an unfriendly and suspicious folk, and before he left them, he asked them for the spear and the boat that he had seen them make, the spear Gugnir and the boat Skidbladnir. The dwarves gave him these things, though in a while after they wondered at themselves for giving it to them. Back to Asgard Loki went. He walked into the council house where the dwellers in Asgard were gathered. He met the stern look in Odin's eyes and the rageful look in Thor's eyes with smiling good humor. "Off with thy veil, O Sif," he said, and when poor Sif took off her veil, he put upon her shorn head the wonderful mass of gold that he held in his palms. Over her shoulders the gold fell, fine and soft, and shining as her own hair. And the Aesir and the Asinir, the gods and goddesses, and the Van and Vana, when they saw Sif's head covered again with the shining web, laughed and clapped their hands in gladness, and the shining web held to Sif's head, as if indeed it had roots and was growing there. Brock brought judgment on Loki. It was then that Loki, with the wish of making the Aesir and the Vanir friendly to him once more, brought out the wonderful things he had gained from the dwarves, the spear Gugnir, and the bolt Skilbladnir. The Aesir and the Vanir marveled at the thing so wonderful. Loki gave the spear as a gift to Odin, and to Frey, who was the chief of the Vanir, gave the boat. All Asgard rejoiced that the thing so wonderful and so helpful had been brought to them, and Loki, who had made a great show in giving these gifts, said boastingly, "None but the dwarves who work for me could make such things. There are other dwarves, but they are as unhandy and as they are misshapen. The dwarves who are my servants are the only ones who can make such wonders." Now Loki, in his boastfulness, had said a foolish thing. There were other dwarves besides those who had worked for him, and one of these was in Asgard. All unknown to Loki, he stood in the shadow of Odin's seat, listening to what was being said. Now he went over to Loki, his little unshapely form trembling with rage. Brock, who was the most spiteful of the dwarves. "Ha, Loki, you boaster," he roared. "You lie in your words. Sindri, my brother, who would scorn to serve you, is the best smith in Svartalfheim." The Aesir and the Vanir laughed to see Loki outfaced by Brock the dwarf in the middle of his boastfulness, and as they laughed, Loki grew angry. "Be silent, dwarf," he said. "Your brother will know about my smith's work when he goes to the dwarves who are my friends and learns something from them." "He learns from the dwarfs who are your friends. My brother Sindri learns from the dwarfs who are your friends," Brock roared in a greater rage than before. "The things you have brought out of Svartalfheim would not be noticed by the Aesir and the Vanir if they were put beside the things that my brother Sindri can make. Sometime we will try your brother Sindri, and see what he can do." Try now, Brock shouted. "I'll wager my head against yours, Loki, that his work will make the dwellers in Asgard laugh at your boastings." "I will take your wager," said Loki, "my head against yours. And glad will I be to see that ugly head of yours, off your misshapen shoulders. The Aesir will judge whether my brother's work is not the best that ever came out of Svartalfheim. And they will see to it that you will pay your wager, Loki, the head off your shoulders. Will ye not sit in judgment, O dwellers of Asgard?" "We will sit in judgment," said the Aesir. And then, still full of rage, Brock the dwarf went down to Svartalfheim and to the place where his brother Sindri worked. There was Sindri in his glowing forge, working the bellows with anvils and hammers beside him, and around him masses of metal, gold and silver and copper and iron. Brock told his tale, how he had wagered his head against Loki's, and that Sindri could make things more wonderful than the spear and the boat that Loki had brought into Asgard. "You were right in what you said, my brother," said Sindri, "and you shall not lose your head to Loki. But the two of us must work at what I am going to forge. It will be your work to keep the fire so that it will neither blaze up nor die down for a single instant. If you can keep the fire as I tell you, we will forge a wonder. Now, brother, keep your hands upon the bellows and keep the fire under your control." Then into the fire Sindri threw not a piece of metal but a pig's skin. Brock kept his hands on the bellow, working it so that the fire neither died down nor blazed up for a single instant. And in the glowing fire, the pigskin swelled itself into a strange shape. But Brock was not left to work the bellows in peace. Into the forge flew a gadfly. It lighted on Brock's hands and stung them. The dwarf screamed with pain, but his hands still held the bellows, working it to keep the fire steady, for he knew that the gadfly was Loki, and that Loki was striving to spoil Sindri's work. Again the gadfly stung his hands, but Brock, although his hands felt as if they were pierced with hot irons, still worked the bellows so that the fire did not blaze up nor die down for a single instant. Sindri came and looked into the fire. Over the shape that was rising, he said words of magic. The gadfly had flown away, and Sindri bade his brother cease working. He took out the thing that had been shaped in the fire, and he worked over it with a hammer. It was a wonder indeed, a boar, all golden, that could fly through the air, and it shed light from its bristles as it flew. Brock forgot the pain in his hands and screamed with joy. "This is the greatest of wonders," he had said. "The dwellers in Asgard will have to give the judgment against Loki. I shall have Loki's head. I shall have Loki's head." But Sindri said, "The boar golden bristle may not be judged as great a wonder as the spear Gugnir or the bolt Skidbladnir. We must make something more wonderful still. Work the bellows as before, brother, and do not let the fire die down or blaze up for a single instant." Then Sindri took up a piece of gold that was so bright it lighted up the dark cavern that the dwarfs worked in. He threw the piece of gold into the fire. Then he went to make something else and left Brock to work the bellows. The gadfly flew in again. Brock did not know it was there until it lighted on the back of his neck. It stung him until Brock felt the pain was wrenching him apart. But still, he kept his hands on the bellows, working it so that the fire neither blazed up nor died down for a single instant. When Sindri came to look in the fire, Brock was not able to speak for pain. Again, Sindri said magic words over the gold that was being smelted in the fire. He took it out of the glow and worked it over on the main anvil. Then in a while he showed Brock something that looked like the circle of the sun. "A splendid arm ring, my brother," he said. "An arm ring for a god's right arm. And this ring had hidden wonders. Every ninth night 8 rings itself would drop from its arm, for this is Draupnir, the ring of increase. To Odin, the father of the gods, the ring shall be given," said Brock. "And Odin will have to declare that nothing so wonderful or so profitable to the gods was ever brought into Asgard. O Loki, cunning Loki, I shall have thy head in spite of thy tricks." "Be not too hasty, brother," said Sindri. "What we have done so far is good, but better still must be the thing that makes the dwellers in Asgard give the judgment that delivers Loki's head to thee. Work as before, brother, and do not let the fire blaze up or die down for a single instant." This time, Sindri flew into the fire a bar of iron. Then he went away to fetch the hammer that would shape it. Brock worked the bellows as before, but only his hands were steady, for every other part of him was trembling with the expectation of the gadfly's sting. He saw the gadfly dart into the forge. He screamed as it flew round and around him, searching out a place where it might sting him most fearfully. It lighted down on his forehead, just between the eyes. The first sting it gave took the sight from his eyes. It stung again, and Brock felt the blood flowing down. Darkness filled the cave. Brock tried to keep his hands steady on the bellows, but he did not know whether the fire was blazing up or dying down. He shouted, and Sindri hurried up. Sindri said the magic words over the thing that was in the fire, and then he drew it out. "An instant more," he said, "and the work would have been perfect. But because you let the fire die down for an instant, the work is not as good as it might have been." He took what was shaped in the fire to the main anvil and worked it. Then when Brock's eyesight came back to him, he saw a great hammer, a hammer all of iron. The handle did not seem long enough to balance the head. This was because the fire had died down for an instant while it was being formed. "The hammer is Mjolnir," said Sindri, "and it is the greatest of the things that I am able to make. All in Asgard must rejoice to see this hammer. Thor will be the only one able to wield it. Now I am not afraid of the judgment that the dwellers in Asgard will give." "The dwellers in Asgard will have to give judgment for us," Brock cried out. "They will have to give judgment for us, and the head of Loki, my tormentor, will be given to me. No more wonderful or more profitable gifts than these have ever been brought into Asgard," said Sindri. "Thy head is saved, and thou wilt be able to take the head of Loki, who is insolent to us. Bring it here, and we shall throw it into the fire in the forge." The Aesir and the Vanir were seated in the council house of Asgard, when a train of dwarfs appeared before them. Brock came at the head of the train, and he was followed by a band of dwarfs carrying things of great weight. Brock and his attendants stood round the throne of Odin and hearkened the words of the father of the gods. "We know why you have come into Asgard, out of Svartalfheim," Odin said. "You have brought things wonderful and profitable to the dwellers in Asgard. Let what you have brought be seen, Brock. If they are more wonderful and more useful than the things Loki has brought out of Svartalfheim, the spear Gugnir and the bolt Skidbladnir, we will give judgment to you." Then Brock commanded the dwarfs who waited on him to show the dwellers in Asgard the first of the wonders that Sindri had made. They brought out the boar Golden Bristle. Round and round the council house the boar flew, leaving a track of brightness. The dwellers in Asgard said to one another that this was a wonder indeed, but none would say that the boar was a better thing to have in Asgard than the spear that would hit the mark no matter how badly it was flung, or the boat that would sail on any sea that could be folded up so small that it would fit in anyone's pocket. None would say that Golden Bristle was better than these wonders. To Frey, who was the chief of the Vanir, Brock gave the wondrous boar. Then the attending dwarves showed the arm ring that was as bright as the circle of the sun. All admired the noble ring, and then when it was told how every 9th night this ring dropped 8 rings of gold that were like itself, and the dwellers in Asgard spoke aloud, saying that Draupnir, the ring of increase, was a wonder indeed. Hearing their voices raised, Brock looked triumphantly up to Loki, who was standing there with his lips drawn closely together. To Odin, the father of the gods, Brock gave this noble arm ring. Then he commanded the attending dwarfs to lay before Thor the hammer Mjolnir. Thor took up the hammer and swung it around his head. And as he did so, he uttered a great cry. And the eyes of the dwellers in Asgard lighted up when they saw Thor with the hammer Mjolnir in his hands. Their eyes lightened up. From their lips came the cry, "This is a wonder indeed. With this hammer in his hand, no one can withstand Thor, our champion. No greater thing has ever come into Asgard than the hammer Mjolnir." Then Odin, the father of the gods, spoke from his throne, giving judgment. "The hammer Mjolnir that the dwarf Brock has brought into Asgard is a thing wonderful indeed and profitable to the gods. In Thor's hands it can crush mountains and hurl the giant race from the ramparts of Asgard. Sindri the dwarf has forged a greater thing than the spear Gugnir and the boat Skidbladnir. There can be no other judgment." Brock looked at Loki, showing his gnarled teeth. "Now, Loki, yield your head, he cried. "Do not ask such a thing," said Odin. "Put any other penalty on Loki for mocking you and tormenting you. Make him yield to you the greatest thing that is in his power to give." Not so, cried Brock. "You dwellers in Asgard would shield each other. But what of me? Loki would have taken my head had I lost the wager. Loki has lost his head to me. Let him kneel down till I cut it off." Loki came forward, smiling with closed lips. "I kneel before you, dwarf," he said. "Take off my head. But be careful, do not touch my neck. I did not bargain that you should touch my neck. If you do, I shall call upon the dwellers in Asgard to punish you." Brock drew back with a snarl. "Is this the judgment of the gods?" he asked. "The bargain you made, Brock," said Odin, "was an evil one, and all its evil consequences you must bear." Brock, in a rage, looked up at Loki and saw that his lips were smiling. He stamped his feet and raged, and then he went up to Loki and said, "I may not take your head, but I can do something with your lips that mock me." "What would you do, dwarf?" said Thor. "Sew Loki's lips together so that he can do no more mischief with his talk. You dwellers in Asgard cannot forbid me to do this. Down, Loki, on your knees before me." Loki looked upon the dwellers in Asgard and saw their judgment was that he must kneel before the dwarf. He knelt down with a frown in his brow. "Draw your lips together, Loki," said Brock. And Loki drew his lips together while his eyes flashed fire. With an awl that he took from his belt, Brock pierced Loki's lips. He took out a thong and tightened them together. Then in triumph the dwarf looked upon Loki. "Oh, Loki," he said, "you boasted that the dwarfs who worked for you were far better craftsmen than Sindri, my brother. Your words have been shown to be lies, and now you cannot boast for a while." Then Brock the dwarf, with great majesty, walked out of the council house of Asgard, and the attending dwarfs behind him in procession. Down the passages of the earth the dwarfs went, singing the song of Brock's triumph over Loki, and in Svartenheim it was told forever after how Sindri and Brock had prevailed. And in Asgard, now that Loki's lips were closed, there was peace and respite from mischief. Not one among the Aesir or the Vanir were sorry when Loki had to walk about in silence with his head bent low. How Freya gained her necklace and how her loved one was lost to her. Yes, Loki went through Asgard silent and with his head bent, and the dwellers in Asgard said one unto the other, "This will teach Loki to work no more mischief." They did not know that what Loki had done had sown the seeds of mischief, and that these seeds were to sprout up and bring sorrow to the great beautiful Vana Freya, and to Freya whom the giant wanted to carry off with the sun and the moon as payment for his building the wall around great Asgard. Freya had looked upon the wonders that Loki had brought into Asgard, the golden threads that were Sif's hair, and Frey's boar that shed light from its bristles as it flew. And the gleam of these golden things dazzled her, and made her dream in the daytime and the nighttime of the wonders that she herself might possess. And often she thought, what wonderful things 3 giant women would give me if I could bring myself to go to them on their mountaintop. Long ere this, when the wall around their city was not yet built, and when the gods had set up only the court with their 12 seats, and the hall that was for Odin and the hall that was for the goddesses, there had come into Asgard 3 giant women. They came after the gods had set up the forge and begun to work metal for their buildings. The metal they worked was pure gold. With gold they built Gladstime, the hall of Odin, and with gold they made their dishes and their household ware. And then there was the age of gold, and the gods did not grudge gold to anyone. Happy were the gods then, and no shadows nor foreboding lay on Asgard. But after the 3 giant women came, the gods began to value gold and hoard it. They played with it no more, and their happy innocence of their first days departed from them. At last the 3 were banished from Asgard. The gods turned their thoughts from the hoarding of gold, and they built up their city, and they made themselves strong. And now Freya, the lovely Vanir bride, thought upon the giant women and the wonderful things of gold that had flashed through their hands. But not to Odir, her husband, she did not speak such thoughts, for Odir, more than any of the dwellers of Asgard, was wont to think on the days of happy innocence, before the gold came to be hoarded and valued. Odir would not have Freya go near the mountaintop where the 3 giants had their high seat. But Freya did not cease to think upon them and upon the gold that they had. Why should Odir know I went to them, she said to herself. No one will tell them. And what difference will it make if I go to them and gain some lovely things for myself? I shall not love Odir the less because I go my own way for once. Then one day she left their palace, leaving Odir her husband playing with their little children Hnossa. She left the palace and went down to the earth. There she stayed for a while, tending the flowers that were her charge. After a while she asked the elves to tell her where the mountains on which the 3 giant women stayed. The elves were frightened and would not tell her, although she was a queen over them. She left them and stole down into the caves of the dwarfs. It was they who showed her the way to the great seat of the giant women. But before they showed her the way, they made her feel shame and misery. "We will show you the way if you stay here with us," said one of the dwarves. "For how long will you have me stay?" "Until the cocks in Svartenheim crow," said the dwarves, closing round her. "We want to know what the company of one of the Vanir is like." "I will stay," Freya said. Then one of the dwarfs reached up and put his arms around her neck and kissed her with his ugly mouth. Freya tried to break from them, but the dwarfs held her. "You cannot go away from us now until the cock of Svartenheim crows," she said. Then another dwarf pressed to her and kissed her. They made her sit down beside them on the heaps of skin they had. When she wept, they screamed at her and beat her. One, when she would not kiss him on the mouth, bit her hands, so Freya stayed with the dwarfs until the cocks of Svartenheim crew. They showed her the mountains on the top of They showed her the mountain on top of which the three had banished from Asgard had their abode. The giant women sat overlooking the world of men. "What would you have from us, wife of Odin?" one who was called Gluvig said to her. "Alas, now I have found you, and you know I shall ask you for naught," Freya said. "Speak, Vana," said the second of the giant women. The third said nothing, but she held up her hands in a necklace of gold most curiously fashioned. "How bright it is," Freya said. "There is a shadow where you sit, women, but the necklace you hold makes brightness now. Oh, how I should joy to wear it." "It is the necklace Brisnigamen," said the one who is called Gulvig. "It is yours to wear, wife of Odin," said the one who held it in her hands. Freya took the shining necklace and clasped it around her throat. She could not bring herself to thank the giant women, for she saw there was evil in their eyes. She made reverence to them, however, and she went from the mountains on which they sat overlooking the world of men. In a while she looked down and saw Brisnigamen, and her misery went from her. It was the most beautiful thing ever made by hands. None of the Asinir and none of the Vesnir possessed a thing so beautiful. It made her more and more lovely, and Odin, she thought, would forgive her when she saw how beautiful and how happy Brisnigamen made her. She rose from among the flowers and took the leave of the slight elves and made her way into Asgard. All who greeted her looked long and with wonder upon the necklace that she wore. And into the eyes of the goddesses there came a look of longing when they saw Brisnigamen. But Freya hardly stopped to speak to anyone. As swiftly as she could make her way into her own palace, she would show herself to Odin and win his forgiveness. She entered her shining palace and called to him. No answer came. Her child, little Hnossa, sat on the floor playing. Her mother took her into her arms, but the child, when she looked upon Brisnigamen, turned away crying. Freya left Hnossa down and searched again for Hoder. He was not in any part of the house. She went into the houses of all who dwelt in Asgard, asking tidings of him. None knew where he had gone to. At last Freya went back into their palace and waited for Odin to come home, but Odin did not come. One came to her. It was a goddess, Odin's wife, the queenly Frigga. "You are waiting for Odin, your husband," Frigga said. "Ah, let me tell you, Odin will not come to you here. He went when for the sake of a shining thing you did what made him unhappy. Odin has gone from Asgard, and no one knows where to search for him." "I will seek him outside of Asgard," Freyr said. She wept no more, but she took her little child Hnossa and put her in Frigga's arms. And then she mounted her car that was drawn by two cats and journeyed down from Asgard to Midgard, the earth, to search for Odin, her husband. Year in and year out, and over all the earth, Freya went searching and calling for the lost Odin. She went as far as the bounds of the earth, where she could look over to Jotunheim, where dwelt the giant who would have carried her off with the sun and the moon as payment for building the wall around Asgard. But in no palace, from the end of the rainbow Bifrost that stretched from Asgard to earth, to the boundary of Jotunheim, did she find a trace of her husband Odin. At last she turned her car towards Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, that stretched from Midgard the earth, to Asgard, the dwelling of the gods. Heimdall, the watcher for the gods, guarded the rainbow bridge. To him Freya went, with half-hope fluttering in her heart. "O Heimdall," she cried. "O Heimdall, watcher for the gods, speak to me if you know where Odin is." "Odin is in every place the searcher has not come. Odin is in every place the searcher has left. Those who seek him will never find Odin," said Heimdall, the watcher for the gods. Then Freya stood on the Bifrost and wept. Freyja, the queenly goddess, heard the sound of her weeping, and came out of Asgard to comfort her. "Ah, what comfort can you give me, Freyja?" cried Freya. "What comfort can you give me when Odin will never be found by one who searches for him?" "Behold how your daughter, the child Hnossa, has grown," said Freyja. Freya looked up and saw a beautiful maiden standing on the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge. She was young, more youthful than any of the Vanir or the Aesir, and her face and her form so lovely that all hearts became melted when they looked upon her. And Freya was comforted in her loss. She followed Frigga across the Bifrost and came once again into the city of the gods. In her own palace in Asgard, Freya dwelt with Hnossa her child. Still she wore round her neck Brisningamen, the necklace that lost her odor. But now she wore it not for its splendor, but as the sign of the wrong she had done. She weeps, and her tears become golden drops as they fall upon the earth. And by the poets who know her story, she is called the beautiful Lady in Tears. Frey, the chief of the Vanir, longed to have sight of his sister who had been from Asgard for so long. You must know that this happened during the time when Freya was wandering through the world seeking for her husband, the lost Odir. Now there was in Asgard a place from which one could overlook the world and have a glimpse of all who wandered there. Oh boy. That place was Hlidskjalf, Odin's lofty watchtower. I hope it was. High up into the blue of the air that tower went. Frey came to it, and he knew that Odin Allfather was not upon the mount. Only his two wolves, Geri and Freki, that crouched beside Odin's seat at the banquet, were there, and they stood in the way of Frey's entrance to the tower. But Frey spoke to Geri and Freki in the language of the gods, and Odin's wolves had let him pass. But, as he went up the steps within the tower, Frey, chief of the Vanir, knew that he was doing a fateful thing. For none of the high gods, not even Thor the defender of Asgard, nor Baldur the best loved of the gods, had ever climbed to the top of that tower and seated themselves upon the Allfather's seat. But if I could see my sister once, I should be contented, said Frey to himself, and no one can come to harm me if I look down upon the world. He came up to the top of the tower. He seated himself on Odin's lofty seat. He looked out into the world. He saw Midgard, the world of men, with its houses and towns, its farms and its people. Beyond Midgard he saw Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, terrible with its dark mountains and masses of snow and ice. He saw Freya as she went upon her wanderings, and he marked that her face had turned towards Asgard, and that her steps were leading towards the city of the gods. Have contented myself by looking from the tower, said Frey to himself, and no harm has come to me. But even as he spoke, his gaze was drawn to a dwelling that stood in the middle of the ice and snow of Jotunheim. Long had he gazed upon that dwelling without knowing why he looked that way. Then when the door of the house was opened, and a giant maiden stood on the doorway, Frey gazed at her. So great was the beauty of her face that it was like starlight in a dark land. She looked down from the doorway of the house, and then turned and went within, shutting the door. Frey sat on Odin's high seat, and then she went down into the steps of the tower and passed by the two wolves. Frey sat on Odin's high seat for long, and then he went down the steps of the tower and passed by the two wolves, Geri and Freki, that looked threateningly upon him. He went through Asgard, but he found no one to please him in the city of gods. That night, sleep did not come to him, for his thoughts were fixed upon the lovely giant maid who he had looked upon. And when the morning came, he was filled with loneliness because he thought himself so far from her. He went to the tower again, thinking to climb the tower and have a sight of her once more. But now the two wolves, Geri and Freki, bared their teeth at him and would not let him pass, although he spoke to them again in the language of the gods. He went and spoke to the wise Njord, his father. "She who you have seen, my son," said Njord, "is Gerda, daughter of the giant Gymir. You must give over thinking of her. Your love for her would be an ill thing for you." "Why would it be an ill thing for me?" Frey said. "Because you would have to give that which you prize most for the sake of coming to her." "That which I prize most," Frey said, "is my magic sword." "You will have to give your magic sword," said his father, the wise Njord. "I will give it," said Frey, loosening his magic sword from his belt. "Bethink, my son," said Njord. "If thou givest thy sword, what weapon wilt thou have on the day of Ragnarok, when the giants make war upon the gods?" Frey did not speak, but he thought the day of Ragnarok was far off. "I cannot live without Gerda," he said, and he turned away. There was once in Asgard one who was called Skirnir. He was a venturesome being who never cared what he said or did. To no one else but Skirnir, Frey could bring himself the trouble that had fallen upon him, the trouble that was the punishment for his placing himself on the seat of the Allfather. Skirnir laughed when he heard of Frey's tale. "Thou, a van, in love with a maid of Jotunheim? This is fun indeed. Will ye make a marriage of it?" "Would that I might speak to her or send a message of love to her," said Frey, "but I may not leave my watch over the elves." "And if I should take a message to Gerda," said Skirnir, the venturesome, "what would my reward be?" "My boat, Skilbladnir, or my boar, Golden Bristle," said Frey. "No, no," said Skirnir. "I want something to go by my side. I want something to use in my hand. Give me the magic sword you own." Frey thought upon what his father had said, that he would be left weaponless on the day of Ragnarok, when the giants would make war upon the gods, and when Asgard would be endangered. He thought upon this and drew back from Skirnir. For a while he remained in thought. And all the time, thick-set, Skirnir was laughing at him, out of his wide mouth and his blue eyes. Then Frey said to himself, "The day of Ragnarok is far off, and I cannot live without Gerda." He drew the magic sword from his belt, and he placed it in Skirnir's hand. "I will give you my sword, Skirnir," he said. "Take my message to Gerda, Gymir's daughter. Show her this gold and these precious jewels, and say that I love her, and that I claim her love." "I shall bring the maid to you," said Skirnir the venturesome. "But how wilt thou get to Jotunheim?" said Frey, suddenly remembering how dark the giants' land was, and how terrible there were approaches to it. "Oh, with a good horse and a good sword, one can get anywhere," said Skirnir. "My horse is a mighty horse, and you have given me your sword of magic. Tomorrow I shall make the journey." Skirnir rode across Bifrost the Rainbow Bridge, laughing out of his wide mouth and his blue eyes at Heimdall the warder of the bridge to Asgard. His mighty horse trod the earth of Midgard, and swam in the river that divides Midgard, the world of men, from Jotunheim, the realm of giants. He rode on heedlessly and recklessly, as he did all things. Then out of the iron forests came the monstrous wolves of Jotunheim to tear and devour him and his mighty horse. It was well for Skirnir that he had by his belt Frey's magic sword. Its edge slew and its gleam frightened the monstrous beasts. On and on Skirnir rode his mighty horse, and he came to a wall of fire. No other horse but his mighty horse could go through it. And Skirnir rode through the fire and came to the dale in which was Gymir's dwelling. And now he was before the house that Freya had seen Gerda enter that day when he climbed the tower and sat upon Odin's throne. The mighty hounds that guarded Gymir's dwelling came and bayed around him, but the gleam of his magic sword kept him away. Skirnir backed his horse to the door and made his horse's hooves strike against it. Gymir was in the feast hall with his giant friends, and he did not hear the baying of the hounds nor the clatter that Skirnir made before the door. But Gerda sat spinning with her maidens in the hall. "Who comes to Gymir's door?" she said. "A warrior upon a mighty horse," said one of the maidens. "Even though he may be an enemy and one who slew my brother, yet we shall open the door to him and give him a cup of Gymir's mead," said Gerda. One of the maidens opened the door, and Skirnir entered Gymir's dwelling. He knew Gerda amongst her maidens. He went to her and showed her the rich gold and the precious jewels that he had brought from Frey. "These are for you, fairest Gerda, if you will give your love to Frey, chief of the Vanir." "Show your gold and jewels to my other maidens," said Gerda. "Gold and jewels will never bring me love." Then Skirnir the Venturesome, heedless of his words, drew the magic sword from his belt and held it above her. "Give your love to Frey, who has given me this sword," he said, "or meet your death by the edge of it." Gerda, Gymer's daughter, only laughed at reckless Skirnir. "Make the daughters of men fearful by the sharpness of Frey's sword, but do not try to frighten a giant's daughter with it," she said. Then Skirnir the Reckless, heedless of his words, made the magic sword flash before her eyes, while he cried out in a terrible voice, saying a spell over her. "Gird, I will curse ye, yes, with this magic. Blade I shall touch thee. Such is its power, that, like a thistle, wildered 'twill leave thee, like a thistle in the wind, strips from the roof." Hearing these terrible words, strange hissings of the magic sword, Gerda threw herself on the ground, crying out for pity. But Skirnir stood above her, and the magic sword flashed, hissing above her. Skirnir sang, "More ugly I'll leave thee than the maid ever was. Thou wilt be mocked at by giants and dwarves, and by men, and only dwarves will wed thee. Now on this instant, with this blade I shall touch thee, and leave thee bespelled." She lifted herself on her knees and cried out to Skirnir to spare her from the spell of the magic sword. "Only if thou wilt give thy love to Frey," said Skirnir. "I will give my love to him," said Gerda. "Now put up thy magic sword and drink a cup of mead and depart from Gymer's dwelling." "I will not drink a cup of your mead, nor shall I depart from this dwelling until you yourself say that you will meet and speak with Frey." "I will meet and speak with him," Gerda said. "When will you meet and speak with him?" asked Skirnir. "In the wood of Barri 9 nights from now. Let him come and meet me there." Then Skirnir put up his magic sword and drank the cup of mead that Gerda gave him. He rode from Gymer's house, laughing aloud at having won Gerda for Frey, and so making the sword of his own forever. Skirnir the Venturesome, heedless of his words, riding across Bifrost on his mighty horse, found Frey standing waiting for him beside Heimdall, the warder of the bridge to Asgard. "What news dost thou bring me?" cried Frey. "Speak, Skirnir, before thou dismount from thine horse." In 9 nights from this thou mayst meet Gerda in Barri Wood," said Skirnir. He looked at him, laughing out of his wide mouth and his blue eyes. But Frey turned away, saying to himself, "Long is one day, long, long two. Can I live, though, 9 long days?" Long indeed were these days for Frey, but the 9th day came, and in the evening Frey went to Barri Wood, and there he met Gerda the giant maid. She was as fair as when he had seen her before the door at Gymer's house. And when she saw Frey, so tall and noble looking, the giant's daughter was glad that Skirnir the Venturesome had made her promise to come to Barri Wood. They had given each other rings of gold. It was settled that the giant maid should come as a bride to Asgard. All the dwellers in Asgard were standing before the giant gate, waiting to welcome the bride of Frey. There appeared a giant maid, who was not Gerda. All in armor was she. "I am Skadi," she said, "daughter of Thiassi. My father met his death at the hands of the dwellers in Asgard. I claim a recompense." "What recompense would you have, my maiden?" asked Odin, smiling to see a giant maid standing so boldly in Asgard. "A husband from among you," said Gerda, "even as Gerda. I ask myself must be let choose him." And all laughed at the words of Skadi. Then said Odin, laughing, "We will let you choose a husband from among us, but you must choose him by his feet." "I will choose him by whatever way you will," said Skadi, fixing her eyes on Baldur, the most beautiful of all the dwellers in Asgard. They put a bandage around her eyes, and the Aesir and the Vanir sat in a half-circle around. And as she went, she stooped over each and laid her hands upon their feet, and at last she came to the one whose feet were so finely formed that she was sure it was Baldur. And she said, "This is the one that Skadi chooses for her husband." Then the Aesir and the Vanir laughed more and more, They took the bandage off her eyes, and she saw not Baldur the Beautiful, but Njord, the father of Frey. But as Skadi looked more and more upon Njord, she became more and more contented with her choice, for Njord was strong and he was noble-looking. These two, Njord and Skadi, were the first to live in Njord's palace by the sea. But the coming of the sea mew would waken Skadi too early in the morning, and she drew her husband to the mountain-top where she was more at home. He would not live long away from the sound of the sea. Back and forward between the mountain of the sea, Skadi and Njord went. But Gerda stayed in Asgard with Frey her husband, and the Aesir and the Vanir came to love greatly Gerda, the giant maid. Heimdall and the little Hnossa, how all things come to be. Hnossa, child of Freya and of the lost Odur, was the youngest of all the dwellers in Asgard. And because it had been prophesied that the child would bring her father and her mother together, little Hnossa was often taken without the city of the gods to stand by Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, so that she might greet Odur if his steps ever returned towards Asgard. In all the palaces of the city of the gods, little Hnossa made welcome. In Fensalir, the halls of mist, where Frigga the wife of Odin Allfather sat spinning golden threads, and Breidablik, where Baldur the well-beloved lived with his fair wife, the young Nanna. In Blikskirnir, the winding house, where Thor and Sif lived, and in Odin's very own palace, Valaskjalf, was the great that was all roofed over with silver shields. The greatest of all of the palaces was Gladstheim, that was built by the golden-leafed wood, Glasir. Here the banquets of the gods were held. Often little Hnossa looked within and saw Odin Allfather sitting at the banquet table with a mantle of blue over him and a shining helmet shaped like an eagle above his head. Odin would sit there, not eating at all, but drinking the wine of the gods, and taking the food off the table and giving it to Geri and Freki, the two wolves crouched beside his seat. She loved to go outside to the great gate and stay beside Heimdall, the warder of the Rainbow Bridge. There, when there was no one crossing that she might watch, she would sit beside Heimdall and listen to the wonders that he spoke of. Heimdall held in his hands the horn that was called Gjallarhorn. He would sound it to the dwellers in Asgard, and no one was crossing the Rainbow Bridge. And when Heimdall told little Hnossa how he trained himself to hear the grasses grow, and how he could see all around him for hundreds of miles, he could see in the night as well as the day. He never slept. He had 9 mothers, he told Hnossa, and he fed on the strength of the earth and the cold sea. As she sat beside him day after day, Heimdall would tell little Hnossa how all things began. He had lived from the beginning of time, and he knew all things. Before Asgard was built, he said, and before Odin lived, earth and sea and sky were all mixed together. And what was then was the chasm of chasms. In the north there was Niflheim, the palace of the deadly cold. In the south there was Muspelheim, the land of the fire. In Niflheim there was a cauldron called Vilgilmir, that poured out 12 rivers that flowed into the chasm of chasms. Gagap, the chasm of chasms, filled up with ice from the waters of the river as they flowed and poured into it. From Muspelheim came the clouds of fire that turned the ice into thick mists, and the mists fell down again in drops of dew, and from these drops were formed Ymir, the ancient giant. Ymir, the ancient giant, traveled along by the 12 rivers until he came to where there was another living form standing in the mists. This was a giant cow. Oddhulma was the name of that cow. Ymir lay down beside her and drank her milk, and on the milk she gave him he lived. Other beings were formed out of the dew that fell to the ground. They were the daughters of the frost, and Ymir the ancient giant married one, and their children were giants. One day Ymir saw Iduna breathe upon a cliff of ice and lick it with her tongue at the place she breathed upon. As her tongue went over and over the place, he saw that a figure was being formed. It was not like a giant's form, it was more shapely and beautiful. And a head appeared in the cliff, and a golden hair fell from over the ice. And as Ymir looked upon that being formed, he hated him for his beauty. Aldhulma, the giant cow, went on licking the place where she had breathed, and at last a man, completely formed, stepped from the cliff. Ymir, the ancient giant, hated him so much that he would have slain him then and there, but he knew that if he did this, Aldhulma would feed him no more with her milk. Bur was the name of the man who stood formed in the ice of the cliff, Bur the first hero. He too lived on the milk of Aldhulma. He married a daughter of the ancient giant, and he had a son. But Ymir and Ymir's son hated Bur, and when the time came at last, they were able to kill him. And now there was a war between Ymir and Ymir's sons, and the son of the sons of Bur. And Odin was the son of Bur's son. Odin brought all his brothers together, and they were able to destroy Ymir and his brood, all except one. So huge was Ymir that when he was slain, his blood poured out into such a mighty flood that all his sons were drowned in it, all except Bergelmir, who was in a boat with his wife when the flood came, and who floated away on the flood to a place that we now call Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. Now Odin and his sons took the body of Ymir, the vastest body that ever was, and they flung it up into the chasm of chasms, filling up all the hollow places within it. Then they dug the bones out of the body, and they piled them up into the mountains. They took the teeth out, and they made them into rocks. And they took the hair of Ymir, and they made it into the forests and the trees. They took his eyebrows, and formed them into the place where men now dwell, Midgard. And out of Ymir's hollow skull they made the sky. And Odin and his sons and brothers did more than this. They took the sparks and the clouds of flames that blew from Muspelheim, and they made them into the sun and the moon, and all of the stars that are in the sky. Odin found a dusky giantess named Night, whose son was called Day, and he gave them both horses to drive across the sky. Night drove a horse named Rimfax, Frosty Mane, and Day drove a horse named Skinfax, Shining Mane. From Rimfax's bit falls the drops that make the dew on the earth. Then Odin and his sons made a race of men and women and gave them Midgard to live in. Ugly dwarves had grown up and had spread themselves over the earth. These Odin made go live in the hollow places beneath the earth. The elves he let stay on the earth, but he gave them tasks of tending the streams and the grasses and the flowers. And with the Vanir he made peace, and after war had been waged, taking Njord from them for a hostage. Bergelmir, the giant who escaped drowning in Ymir's blood, had sons and daughters in Jotunheim. They hated Odin and his sons and strove against him. When Odin lighted up the world with the sun and the moon, they were wroth, and when they grew up, and when they found the two of the fiercest and mightiest wolves of Jotunheim and set them to follow him. And still the sun and the moon, Sol and Mani, are followed by the wolves of Jotunheim. Such wonders did Heimdall with the golden teeth tell Hnossa, the youngest of the dwellers in Asgard. Often the child stayed with him by the Rainbow Bridge, and she saw gods pass to and from Midgard. Thor with his crown of stars, and with the hammer Mjolnir in his hands, and with gloves of iron that he used when he grasped Mjolnir, Thor in his chariot drawn by 2 goats wearing the belt that doubled his strength. Frigga with her dress of falcon feathers, flying swiftly as a bird, Odin Allfather himself, riding upon Sleipnir, his eight-legged steed, clad all in gold armor, with his golden helmet shaped like an eagle upon his head, and his spear Gugnir in his hand. Heimdall kept his horn in the branch of a great tree. This tree was called Yggdrasil, he told little Hnossa, and it was a wonder to gods and men. No one knows of a time when Yggdrasil was not growing, and all are afraid to speak of the time it will be destroyed. Yggdrasil has 3 roots. One goes deep under Midgard, and another goes deep under Jotunheim, and the third grows above Asgard. Over Odin's hall, a branch of Yggdrasil grows, and it is called the Peace Bough. You see Yggdrasil, little Hnossa, but you do not know all the wonders of it. Far up in his branches, four stags graze. They shake from their horns the water that falls as it rains upon the earth. On the topmost branch of Yggdrasil, the branch so high that the gods themselves can hardly see it, there is an eagle that knows all things. Upon the beak of this eagle a hawk is perched, and a hawk sees what the eyes of the eagle may not see. The root of Yggdrasil that is in Midgard goes deep and down into the place of the dead. Here there is an evil dragon named Nidhogg that gnaws constantly on the root, striving to destroy Yggdrasil, the tree of trees. And Radastok, the squirrel of mischief, behold him now, runs up and down Yggdrasil, making trouble between the eagle above and the dragon below. He goes to tell the dragon how the eagle is bent upon tearing him to pieces, and he goes back to tell the eagle how the dragon plans to devour him. The stories that he brings to Nidhogg make the evil dragon more fierce to destroy Yggdrasil, the tree of trees, so that he may come upon the eagle and devour him. There are two wells by the roots of Yggdrasil, and one is above and one is below. One is beside the root that grows in Jotunheim. This is a well of knowledge, and it is guarded by old Mimir the Wise. Whoever drinks out of this well knows all the things that will come to be. The other well is by the root that grows above Asgard. No one may drink out of this well. The three sisters that are the holy Norns guard it. They take the white water from it to water Yggdrasil, the tree of life, and may keep it strong and growing and green. This well, little Hnossa, is called Urda's well. And little Hnossa heard that by Urda's well there will be two beautiful white swans. They made a music that the dwellers in Asgard often heard, but Hnossa was too young to hear the music that was made by the swans of Urda's well. The Allfather's forebodings how he leaves Asgard. Two ravens had Odin Allfather, Hugin and Mudin were their names, and they flew through all the worlds every day, coming back to Asgard, as they would light on Odin's shoulders and tell him of all the things they had seen and heard. And once a day passed without the ravens coming back. Then Odin, standing on the watchtower, said to himself, I fear for me Hugin lest he not come back, but I will watch more for Munin. A day passed and the ravens flew back. They sat one on each of his shoulders, and then did the Allfather go into the council hall that was beside Glasir, the wood that had the leaves of gold, and hearken to what Hugin and Mudin had to tell him. They told him only of shadows and forebodings. Odin Allfather did not speak to the dwellers in Asgard of the things that they told him, but Freyja his queen saw in his eyes the shadows and forebodings of things to come. And then when he spoke to her about these things, he said, Do not strive against what must take place. Let us go to the holy Norns who sit by Urda's well, and see if the shadows and forebodings remain when you look into their eyes. And so it came that Odin and the gods left Asgard and came to Urda's well, where, under the great root of Yggdrasil, the three Norns sat, with the two fair swans below them. Odin went, and Tyr, the great swordsman, and Baldur, the most beautiful and best beloved of the gods, and Thor with his hammer. A rainbow bridge went from Asgard, city of the gods, to Midgard, the world of men. But another rainbow bridge, more beautiful and tremulous still, went from Asgard to that root of Yggdrasil, under which was Urda's well. This rainbow bridge was seldom seen by men, and where the ends of the two rainbows came together, Heimdall stood, and Heimdall with his golden teeth, the watcher of the gods, and the keeper of the way to Urda's well. Open the gate, Heimdall, said the Allfather. Open the gate, for today the gods would visit the holy Norns. Without a word, Heimdall opened a wide gate that led to the bridge, more colored and more tremulous than any rainbow seen from earth. Then did Odin and Tyr and Baldur step out onto the bridge. Thor followed, but before his foot was placed on the bridge, Heimdall laid his hands upon him. The others may go, but you may not go that way, Thor, said Heimdall. What? Would you, Heimdall, hold me back, said Thor. Yes, for I am keeper of the way to the Norns, said Heimdall. You with the mighty hammer you carry are too weighty for this way. The bridge I guard would break under you, Thor with the hammer. Nevertheless, I will go visit the Norns with Odin and my comrades, said Thor. But not by this way, Thor, said Heimdall. I will not let the bridge be broken under your weight, and the weight of you and your hammer. Leave your hammer here with me if you would go this way. No, no, said Thor. I will not leave anyone in charge of the hammer that defends Asgard. And I may not be turned back from going with Odin and my comrades. There is another way to Urda's well, said Heimdall. Behold, these two great cloud rivers, Kormt and Ermt. Canst thou wade through them? They are cold and suffocating, but they will bring thee to Urda's well, where sit the three holy Norns. Thor looked out to the great rolling rivers of cloud. It was a bad way for one to go, cold and suffocating. Yet if he went that way, he could keep on his shoulder the hammer which he could not leave in another's charge. He stepped out into the cloud river that flowed by the rainbow bridge, and with his hammer upon his shoulder, he went struggling onto the other river. Odin, Tyr, and Balder went beside Urda's well when Thor came struggling out of the cloud river, wet and choking, but with his hammer still upon his shoulder. There stood Tyr, upright and handsome, leaning on his sword that was inscribed all over with magic runes. And there stood Balder, smiling with his head bent as he listened to the murmur of the two fair swans. And there stood Odin All-Father, clad in his blue cloak fringed with golden stars, without the eagle helmet upon his head, and with no spear in his hands. The three Norns, Urda, Verdandi, and Skulda, sat beside the well that was in the hollow of the great root of Yggdrasil. Urda was ancient and with white hair, and Verdandi was beautiful, while Skulda could hardly be seen, for she sat far back, and her hair fell over her face and eyes. Urda, Verdandi, and Skulda, they knew the whole of the past, the whole of the present, and the whole of the future. Odin, looking on them, saw into the eyes of Skulda even. Long, long he stood looking at the Norns with the eyes of a god, while the others listened to the light murmur of the swans and the falling of the leaves of Yggdrasil onto Urda's well. Looking into their eyes, Odin saw the shadows and forebodings that Hugin and Mudin told of him and took shape and substance. And now others came across the rainbow bridge. They were Freyja and Sif and Nanna, the wives of Odin and Thor and Balder. Freyja looked upon the Norns. She did, and as she did, she turned a glance of love and sadness upon Baldur her son, and she drew back and placed her hands upon Nanna's head. Odin turned from gazing upon the Norns and looked upon Freyja his queenly wife. I would leave Asgard for a while, wife of Odin, he said. Yea, said Freyja, much has to be done in Midgard, the world of men. I would change what knowledge I have into wisdom, said Odin, so that the things that are to happen will be changed into the best that they may be. You would go to Mimir's well, said Freyja. I would go to Mimir's well, said Odin. My husband must go then, said Freyja. Then they went back over the rainbow bridge that is more beautiful and more tremulous than the ones the men see from the earth. And they went back over the rainbow bridge, and Aesir and the Aesnir, and Odin and Freyja, and Baldur and Nanna, and Tyr with his sword, and Sif beside Tyr. And as for Thor, he went struggling through the cloud river Kormt and Ermt, his hammer Mjolnir upon his shoulders. Little Hnossa, daughter of the dwellers in Asgards, there standing beside Heimdall, the watcher of the gods and the keeper of the bridge to Urda's well, where Odin All-Father and Freyja his queen went through the great gate with heads bent. Tomorrow, Hnossa heard Odin say, tomorrow I shall be Vegtam the Wanderer, upon the ways of Midgard and Jotunheim. Well, that completes part 1 for now. We will resume with part 2 and the tales of Odin on Earth next Friday.